Alright, let's dive right into a seriously fascinating culinary experiment for today's explainer. Have you ever wondered what the leaders of the free world actually like to sit down and eat after a long day of running the country? Well, the YouTube channel Max the Meat Guy took on this massive challenge. They literally cooked and tasted the favorite foods of every single US president. But they didn't just cook them up for a dry history lesson. No, they put them to a strict modern taste test to see exactly how these centuries-old dishes hold up to the flavors we crave today. So, here is our menu for today. We'll start with the taste test setup, move on to the timeless classics, dig into some highly divisive tastes, review the complete culinary disasters, and finally, deliver our verdict on what this all says about the modern palate. Part 1. The Presidential Taste Test. It's wild to think about how dramatically presidential diets have evolved over the centuries. Back in the 1700s, you had George Washington surviving on rustic simple grains like hoe cakes. Moving into the 1800s, Abraham Lincoln famously favored bacon, a super simple, protein-heavy choice. Fast forward to the 2000s, and we've got George W. Bush favoring cheeseburger pizza. This radical shift really highlights the massive changes in American food availability, processing, and overall culinary complexity. Now, the tasting panel's mission was pretty specific. They judged these historical dishes based entirely on what tastes good right now. They weren't giving out bonus points for historical accuracy. It was strictly about texture, seasoning, sweetness, and the overall culinary appeal for the modern eater. Part 2. Timeless comfort food classics. You know, modern palates absolutely crave rich, balanced flavor profiles, and that's exactly why these universal comfort foods scored so incredibly high. Take Thomas Jefferson's mac and cheese, which was literally served right out of a hollowed-out cheese wheel. Incredible, right? Or Herbert Hoover's sweet potato casserole topped with marshmallows. The tasters actually called it redunculous good. These dishes lean heavily into melted cheese, warm starches, and sweet and savory combinations. Those are pretty much the absolute cornerstones of modern comfort dining. In fact, the tasting panel was in 100% agreement on James Monroe's fried chicken. Every single taster loved it. They specifically called out how crunchy and juicy it was, perfectly highlighting how satisfying textural contrasts never go out of style. Whether you're living in the 1800s or today, the appeal of perfectly fried, crispy poultry is basically hardwired into our culinary DNA. But hey, it wasn't just the heavy, deep-fried foods that won out. Even some of the simpler classics translated incredibly well. George Washington's hoe cakes, for instance, were essentially rustic cornmeal pancakes served with honey. The tasters loved them because they weren't overly sweet. That really appeals to our modern preference for balanced baked goods that don't just overload your sugar receptors. Plus, that cake-like texture made them highly eatable. This really illustrates what works for us today. When we analyze the highest-scoring dishes, the tasters naturally gravitated towards dense, creamy textures. Dwight Eisenhower's fudge is a great example. They described it as smooth, like hot chocolate. They also loved those nostalgic sweet and salty combinations. Today's palate is absolutely obsessed with richness and contrast, heavily rewarding anything that hits those decadent comfort notes. Part 3. Divisive and acquired tastes. It is incredibly interesting how certain historical flavors completely split the room. Take Grover Cleveland's pickled herring. The panel sharply disagreed on this one. One taster actually loved the salty, pickle-like flavor, bringing up childhood nostalgia, but another completely rejected it, flat out stating that the sweet, pickled profile was totally unappealing. It really exposes how divisive fermented and sweet pickled seafood flavors are to our modern taste buds, which are honestly just used to much milder fish preparations nowadays. Then, we have the gamey meats. Did you know both William Henry Harrison and James Garfield claimed squirrel stew as their favorite meal? The creators recreated this. Actually, scratch that. They used rabbit instead of squirrel for safety reasons, but the flavor profile was similar. The dish was praised for its braised, tender texture, but it was firmly rejected by another taster who just couldn't stomach the earthy, gamey meat. We've become so accustomed to the super mild flavors of modern farm chicken and beef that anything slightly wild or gamey can be a huge turnoff. And texture is a massive dividing line. Just listen to this visceral reaction to Jimmy Carter's favorite, grits. When tasting instant grits, one panelist complained they felt like they just ate soggy cardboard. Ouch! It really proves that modern palates strongly reject mushy, unseasoned foundations. If a dish doesn't have a distinct textural appeal or a massive punch of flavor, today's eaters are simply not going to be forgiving. Part 4. Complete culinary disasters. Now we're getting into the historical preferences that completely failed the modern taste test. Harry Truman's absolute favorite food was a well-done steak. The chef even tried to save it by using a premium dry-aged brisket point, just to keep some fat in there, but it was a disaster. A well-done steak is a culinary practice that modern meat enthusiasts consider completely unacceptable. It just produces a dry, tough, chewy texture. For today's steak lovers, cooking all the moisture out of the beef is an absolute deal-breaker. But the ultimate culinary disaster? That belonged to Richard Nixon. His favorite snack was cottage cheese mixed with ketchup. Yeah, just let that flavor profile sit in your mind for a second. The tasting panel had a genuinely intense reaction, calling it one of the worst things they'd ever eaten. The sweetness and tang of the ketchup clashing with those lumpy, milky curds completely violates our modern culinary rules. It is a texture and acidity nightmare. The panel also heavily penalized Barack Obama's infamous claim that plain broccoli was his absolute favorite food, which earned him the nickname Broccoli. The tasters severely doubted its genuine culinary appeal. I mean, let's be real. Almost no one truly prefers plain, unseasoned broccoli over everything else unless it's heavily dressed, roasted, or covered in cheese. It completely failed to register as a satisfying favorite food for a modern palate looking for actual flavor. Part 5. The Final Flavor Verdict. So, after tasting centuries of history, what does this massive experiment reveal about our food preferences? Well, when we categorize the hits and misses, a very clear pattern emerges. We demand bold, comforting flavors like rich mac and cheese, creamy fudges, and crunchy fried chicken. Conversely, we severely punish anything that is bland, mushy like unseasoned grits, overcooked like that well-done steak, or features odd, jarring condiment mixes. Think ketchup on cottage cheese. Texture and richness are basically non-negotiable for us now. And just to neutrally report the results of the source's political bracket framing, the Republican dishes ultimately secured the victory in this blind taste test. As the tasters pointed out, this win was largely carried by universally loved, heavy comfort items. Things like steak, potatoes, and fudge managed to edge out some of the more divisive, unseasoned, or vegetable-heavy dishes on the other side of the aisle. The ultimate takeaway from this explainer is that our palates are entirely a product of our era. They are heavily shaped by modern cooking techniques, the vast availability of rich ingredients, and our own childhood nostalgia. We no longer eat just to survive a cold winter like they did in the 1700s. We eat for complex textural experiences, layered seasoning, and decadent comfort. To wrap up, I want to turn it over to you. We've covered centuries of flavor today, from George Washington's hoe cakes to Richard Nixon's highly questionable cottage cheese concoction. Based on these historical flavor profiles, which presidential dish would you happily invite to your modern dinner table? And which one would you send right back to the history books? Think about how your own palate has been shaped by the modern world. Thanks for joining me on this culinary journey.